Well, about 6 years ago, I was wandering along as a carbon forester, planting trees to capture carbon on the side of Lake Taupo, stop nutrient going into the lake, and I ran into some Comvita guys, and I said, well, you know, what are you doing about your long-term supply chain? And they said, well, we're working the native regen at the moment, but we haven't really done anything in the way of plantations, and we're sort of thinking about it. And at the same time, I was also talking to the Hawke's Bay Regional Council about land above Lake Tutira, and the CEO said, well, we've got this lake that's throwing algal blooms every year. The cattle are pushing the erosion-prone soil into the lake. We're not making any money by running it as a sheep and cattle proposition, so what could we do with it? And so I essentially reached out and put Comvita's hand in the hand of the Hawke's Bay Regional Council, and as a result there's 150 hectares of Manuka Plantation there now. This other photo here, those of you that are familiar with the geography or have been jet boating on the Wanganui and been to the bridge to nowhere, for the bigger boys, that's the sort of proposition that they're looking for right now. It's a sheep and cattle farm that really hadn't had any investment for a long time. So the 1,700 hectares, about 1,000 hectares is already in regenerating Manuka, and it presents a proposition to plant the remaining amount in Manuka. But I guess the thing when the beekeeper approached Comvita that sealed the deal was the fact that we had 5 years of data saying this was a late flowering area that was naturally high in UMF. And when we ran the numbers, it seemed like a good deal. As Stephen alluded to earlier, there's interest in Manuka to the point where people will search around and see who else is planting and put their hives on the boundary. This particular property's at the end of a long windy road, and it's very difficult for anybody to range up alongside because they can't get to the boundary easily. So if you've got a few spare million, that's the sort of proposition, because it's not working as a sheep and cattle farm anymore, and as a land use, it ticks a lot of environmental boxes, so much so that you guys are from Waikato Regional Council, so I can tell stories about Horizon, okay? So a few years ago I had some dealings with Horizon on the Taihape Napier Road, and when we got down to it, the farmer had fenced off 10 kilometres of the Rangitikei River, and Horizon had promised some funding for planting, and then at the 11th hour said, we haven't got any money. Whereas on this property they approached us and said, whoopee, it's part of the Wanganui catchment, you're putting it back into trees, and we'll come along with a subsidy if it's class 6, 7 and 8, which it all is. I've been on a lot of rough land as a forester, but this is quite terrifying on a motorbike, it's particularly if it's been raining. Okay. I was asked to talk about the ideal planning situation. I don't think it exists after many years of trying to organise plantations year on year for forestry purposes. But I take a stab at it, and so I'm saying that about 40 hectares in a steep-sided valley with good road access along the ridges and in the valley floor. In other words, good access for putting a hive platform in there so that your bees are intimately associated with the Manuka plantation. Steep-sided because they tend to be energy conservators and will stay in the valley rather than fly out of it. You know, if you run the numbers, if you go talk to a beekeeper, and Willie's around here somewhere, talk to him, ask him how far his bees fly, and he will say maybe a couple of Ks. Another beekeeper will say a kilometre. If you ran a circle around a kilometre, you've got 300 plus hectares in it. So they have an ability, and some beekeepers will tell you 5Ks, so they have an ability to forage over a large area. So that intimacy between the plantation and the hive platform is becoming increasingly apparent. Despite the fact that that area faces west, the previous photo faces west, I'm suggesting that if you had the choice in an ideal planting situation, you'd choose a north-facing valley, primarily just to get the heat in the valley early and get your bees working earlier, and be away from the prevailing winds and the cooler times that might promise slower growth for your plants. So then if you run a timeline, and I'm saying this somewhat tongue-in-cheek because I've still got people ringing me at this stage of the year and saying, can I plant next week, having done no planning at all and certainly no land preparation. So in an ideal world, you'd want to be looking at your land back in July, August, and sort of saying, well, where is it, how do I identify it, and getting it mapped. And why do we need to get it mapped? Really, because then it gives you a known area to run your numbers against, to budget against with the number of plants you might need, etc., etc. And it sounds almost silly, but you'll be surprised at the number of people that don't actually know what area they're going to plant and think they need 10,000 seedlings, and they're ringing you up next week and saying, can I have another 5,000 please? So a little bit of effort around getting the area properly sorted is well worth it. And then around November, December, you need to be placing order for seedlings. I'm going to the nurseries about that time, and I want to know where those plants are going, and further to that, I want to know more about your site, and therefore I can try and match the seed source of the Manuka to the site that you're planting, if only for reasons of drought in the summer or frost in the winter. And if you get that wrong, you can be spending a lot of money and then suffer the heartache of a frost or a drought later on in the piece. The other thing that's becoming apparent to us as we get into this is the time of flowering. As you go down the country, the Manuka starts early in the north and gets later and later as you go down. We've had a few issues around the centre of the country whereby the beekeeper wants to be operating in December, and the majority of the flowering was in November. So that's another little thing to note, and just make sure you get it right in terms of the species site match. Around the start of the year, you should be looking, when it's relatively dry, you should be looking to make sure your fences, your tracks are all in reasonable condition so you can get your plants to the planting site easily, and you can protect that site from firstly grazing animals if it's part of a farm, and I've pitched this in terms of looking at the marginal part of a farm. But also the noxious animal side of it too. Just a few decent fences restricts their movement around the landscape. I want to start thinking about the vegetation that you have on the block. If you've got woody weeds, then you may be, somebody mentioned gorse earlier and how to treat it. Well, you really need a long lead time for gorse in terms of hitting it with the right chemicals and if necessary, following it up. I have strife with gorse. I used to be in a forest situation where I had no gorse over a large area and I was terribly proud of it, and now having association with beekeepers, I have to do a Nelsonian eye trick and sort of tolerate gorse because it's such a damn good food for bees, and it flowers very early, and so it's giving them the beehive a lot of pollen prior to the flowering of the Manuka. And Linda will talk later about trees for bees and the sort of species that we're trying to put in around the Manuka plantation, primarily for beehive health. So move on to March, April, May. Animal control. That site there looks lovely and benign, but there's a lot of pine plantation in the area, and they're harbouring a lot of goats. I think we've shot 1,500 goats for our 150 hectares in the last 3 years. They just keep coming out of the pines and nibbling. And a lot of people will say, well, Manuka's not that palatable, is it? Yes, it is if it's been grown in a nursery and fed a bit of fertiliser, and the surrounds haven't seen any fertiliser for a long time. Do they want to eat a hard bit of grass, or do they want to eat a succulent little Manuka seedling? Pretty easy decision. So really you've got to get down on things like goats, pigs, hares, rabbits, and just make sure they're in minimal numbers prior to planting. Otherwise, a lot of heartache can result from that. Mentioned weed control. You really need to be back looking in January, February about is it a rough pasture site that I'm addressing, or are there some woody weeds that I'm addressing? And if there's woody weeds involved, then you need to be in earlier with something like metsulfuron and leaving the time for it to work its magic on the woody weeds. And that's around, and then the decisions over how do you address those weeds, around whether it's an aerial, which invariably is the cheaper option. And whilst we did a lot of that sort of area, spot spraying was an expensive exercise. You're asking men to come 40 k's from Napier. It was fine and calm in Napier, and by the time they got to the site they were blown out. And it's under new health and safety regulations. As a land manager, I'm not sure I want to accept the responsibility of putting men over that steep land with 20 litres of chemical on their back anymore, because you, the land manager, are liable. I think we only broke one leg on that site. And yet we could have addressed the whole site in 10 minutes on a calm morning with a helicopter, and it took about 6 weeks to spray that. So those are the sort of decisions you need to make. There are some benefits around spot spraying in that it will give protection for the young seedling. That's a very windy site. We're standing at 500 metres where that photo's taken, so clear day you can see South Pole, so it gets a lot of wind, and that cover around the seedling I think was quite important early on in the seedling's life. And then moving on to the winter, and most of our planting is done between May, if there's enough moisture in the soil, or June invariably through to about September. Growth's down, it's much cooler, and the seedlings are hardened off, hopefully with the odd frost early in the season in the nursery, so they're much easier, and it's much safer to transport them at that time. And some coordination around making sure you minimise the time out of the ground for the seedlings. One of the interesting things for me in dealing with Manuka is that everybody sees it in the landscape and said, well, it's a pioneer and it's a terribly hardy plant, but it's actually quite a soft and sensitive plant, both towards chemicals and towards drought early in its life. And we're probably exacerbating that by growing it in a container in the nursery, but then popping it from the container and putting it into a cardboard box to be able to move it easily around these hilly sites and plant it economically, as opposed to trying to traipse around the side of that hill with a tray in front of you and taking seedlings out individually. We effectively mated into the transport and distribution systems that the foresters have been using for years. Okay, and then you may need to follow up in the spring with some more weed control, and that's really on demand if necessary. If you've done a lot of your good land prep, you may not need to do that, and depending on the animal numbers and how far they're moving into your area, you may need to address animal control on a continuing basis. We've certainly had to do it there, and initially we certainly didn't budget for it. And then hopefully with the last slide, that's what you'd be looking at 18 months down the track. So, happy to answer any questions.
On that block, how many plants did you put in per hectare?
1,100, 3 metres by 3 metres. And Jonathan, who's here somewhere, has done a reasonable amount of testing on the spacing around. For a forester like me, after 40 years of chasing fibre for pulp mills and various other demanding customers, I'm now all about flowers. So I've had to reconfigure that I'm not necessarily in the game of all about fibre. I want a big plant that's vigorous and got the architecture to hang a lot of flowers off. But essentially, if you close it up too much, then you lose all those flowers very, very early in the rotation. So you're trying to have a stand that's starting to close canopy at about age 5, when it's starting to really hit its straps on the nectar scene.
Right.
Is the aim to have a closed canopy or to have individual?
Our estimate is that you want to capture that site, otherwise you'll go on addressing whatever else is growing there for much longer in a weed sense. We don't think there's any real gain, and there may be a loss of production honey-wise by going to a wider spacing. Work in progress, that's a supposition rather than fact at the moment.
On a steeper slope, would you put more in?
No, but invariably you get more. Human nature dictates if I've got a box of seedlings hanging off my backside, I want to get rid of them as quickly as possible. So a lot of your quality control is around chasing the guys down and stopping them planting 1,500 when you only want 1,100.
Is there any more evidence of self-seeding in wider spaces of trees than the big blanket where you get all that black underneath?
Is there any more
evidence of self-seeding?
Oh yes, and I've always taken it as a good sign that the plant's happy in the environment, and
more in an open environment, because I've got self-seeding Manuka on my stream banks.
Yes.
Recently, but I haven't got any evidence of self-seeding in the black underneath of the...
No, you won't. There won't be enough light probably to promote further germination in that situation. Whereas you've probably taken the grazing pressure, I hope you've taken the grazing pressure off your stream banks, and you will be allowing that natural regen to come through.
With these plants, have got very small leaves. Well, the myrtle rust always seems to be hitting the ones with big fat leaves. Am I right? Or is that just a guess?
No, I think you're right. Jonathan will talk more about the myrtle rust later, and I guess that was the sort of intuitive thought that if you had a large, big, flat leaf, you were going to get a lot more leaf wetness for longer, and most fungi operate on degree of leaf wetness. The times when we had big programs spraying for Dothostroma in pines were always after a period of misty, high humidity or out and out heavy rain and long periods of leaf wetness.